Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day. Talked a lot of basketball today, but I do want to touch on the story that was released from ESPN within the past couple days about the Bill Belichick offseason job hunt. The story itself is called Inside Bill Belichick's Failed Offseason Job Hunt. And the story went through the process that Belichick went through this offseason looking for a head coaching job for the first time since 1998. And it talked about the different situations surrounding the head coaching vacancies across the league and how one by one these organizations shut him out. He was really never in heavy consideration for many of these jobs as a whole, but there was some thought that he could end up with the Atlanta Falcons. He ended up interviewing with them twice before they ultimately went a different direction in Raheem Morris. So in those two interviews with Arthur Blank, the first one was just a one-on-one Bill Belichick and Blank on Blank's super yacht. According to the story, Blank came out of that meeting and told his colleagues that he was very impressed by Belichick. In that meeting, Bill said that he didn't want to take over the full control of the decision-making process and have that type of power that he did in New England. He wasn't asking for a change in the decision makers. He reportedly, quote, insisted he just wants to coach. And coming out of this, a source close to Belichick said that from his vantage point, quote, Blank came away from the boat thinking, this is my guy. And Belichick was confident that he was going to be the next head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. There was then a second meeting where Belichick met with Blank and the remainder of the current infrastructure of decision makers. And at some point in between that first and second meeting, Arthur Blank spoke to Patriots owner Robert Kraft multiple times. And a confidant of Belichick gave a quote to ESPN for this story, saying that, quote, Robert called Arthur to warn him not to trust Bill. This quote was then backed up by a second source, one of a close friend of Robert Kraft. And there was another quote thrown in there as well that Kraft told Blank, you'll never have a warm conversation with Belichick. And these conversations reportedly shifted the mindset of the decision-making process with Arthur Blank, and it led to that second interview being more along the lines of giving Belichick the respect he deserved of not just being shut out after one interview, more than it actually was an interview to lock down Belichick as their next head coach. Now, Robert Kraft denies saying anything negative about Belichick in the conversations with Blank during the coaching search. Specifically, there was a quote saying he had no recollection of doing that. Pretty unconvincing there, if you ask me. But there is reportedly a possibility that Kraft could have made some comments to Blank during the regular season about his displeasure with Belichick during the disastrous year for the Patriots. But one way or another, the ESPN story portrays that these conversations between Blank and Kraft, quote, was a big part of why the Falcons went another direction with their head coach search. And that's just a quote from an anonymous source, but the idea of Kraft actually picking up the phone proactively and calling Arthur Blank just to tell him that to not trust Belichick would be a bad look for Kraft in my eyes. And for as much slack as Belichick gets during this post-Tom Brady era in New England, I do think that Kraft deserves some of the blame as well, and some of it goes beyond even just the post-Brady era, where clearly Belichick was in the wrong for trying to push Tom Brady out. Robert Kraft has sort of made it clear that it was Belichick, that Kraft was Team Brady. Belichick sort of made the decision, and it's his fault that Brady went elsewhere and won a Super Bowl. But there is also something to the fact that Brady, for a very long time with New England, was willing to take pay cuts in order to help improve the roster around him. And it got to a certain point during his final couple years there in New England where he looked around and the Patriots had just failed to get him adequate weapons. In 2019, his last season with the Patriots, they had Julian Edelman still, who, of course, is one of Brady's top targets of his career. But Edelman at that point wasn't 100% healthy necessarily. He was able to rack up, though, 100 receptions and 1,100 yards. But after him, the two highest receivers in terms of yards were running back James White and wide receiver Philip Dorsett, who didn't even crack 400 yards. And part of that is, to be fair, due to the fact that Belichick was really struggling drafting skill position players, especially in his final seasons. It was never his expertise, but in that 2019 season as well, they spent their first round pick on N'Keal Harry, where there were plenty of other talented receivers available that have gone on to be big-time players, including T. Higgins, A.J. Brown, and others as well. But another part of the reason that the receivers around Brady weren't good enough is the fact that there was some conflict between Belichick and Kraft surrounding the willingness to actually go and spend money. And Kraft makes it seem like Belichick had all the control he wanted in terms of making these types of decisions and off-season moves, but according to ESPN's roster management system, the Patriots ranked last in the league in cash spending over the past decade. And again, the fact that it is rumored that there was this contention between Kraft and Belichick surrounding the payroll does sort of reflect back on Robert Kraft and this past offseason, despite Gerard Mayo saying, yeah, we're going to go out and acquire talent. We have all this cap space. And he said, quote, we have money to burn. They didn't really end up making any moves in free agency, which I have expressed this before. Sometimes making the panic moves in free agency are actually the ones that end up doing you wrong as the years progress. But it's just a consistent theme with these Kraft teams that they aren't going out and spending consistently in free agency, and as a result, the roster isn't quite as good as it should be. And again, Belichick was in charge of a lot of the personnel decisions as well. The drafting had been horrific. I also feel like there was a level of pettiness, especially in last year's draft, where I think that there was almost a little bit of a vendetta against Mac Jones for complaining against the way that Belichick positioned him so much last year. Mac Jones was very unhappy with the Matt Patricia at offensive coordinator experiment. I myself was as well. But then he went out in the draft and really refused to go and get any types of weapons. Pop Douglas actually ended up being a solid player for them, but he was a 6th round pick out of Liberty. So they didn't draft any skill position players. I think up until then they drafted a couple offensive linemen in like the 4th and 5th rounds, but no offensive players in the top 2, despite their defense actually being good in the 2023 season and or the 2022 season, and the offense being a disaster. So again, there's all of these different factors in here. Last stuff on Kraft here is they also released the Dynasty docuseries that sort of came from a Kraft production camp, and I've only watched the first 2 episodes, so I can't definitively have an opinion on it. But the reputation surrounding it is that it was sort of to boost Kraft's reputation while simultaneously tearing down Bill Belichick. From the first episode, you would have thought that benching Drew Bledsoe for Tom Brady was a mistake. And they spent basically a whole hour-long episode talking about how risky it was for the Patriots to hire Bill Belichick because of the situation that was surrounding him when he was with the Cleveland Browns as the head coach there. They practically skipped over 2 whole Super Bowls. And again, I haven't seen the full docu-series. If you have, definitely let me know what your thoughts were. But former Patriots players and viewers all seem to sort of share this sentiment that it was Kraft sort of trying to give himself more credit for this whole thing about how Bill Belichick, it was a mess behind closed doors and Kraft was able to keep it all together. And it's just a lot of Robert Kraft sort of pointing fingers to why they haven't been successful. And I also think that moving on from Bill Belichick was the right decision this offseason. With his history at general manager, it had not been good and they needed a change, but now there's nobody else to blame here, and I do think that Robert Kraft is under a lot of pressure in this situation. Briefly here, as for Belichick and his future, Robert Kraft talking to Arthur Blank was not the sole reason that Belichick doesn't have a head coaching job today. If you look at the interview process with Atlanta alone, the Falcons were looking at 14 different candidates. They did a voting process democratically where they ranked the top candidates, and Belichick didn't finish in anyone's top 3, according to the ESPN article. And the fact that the Falcons were the only team that had any interest in him does speak volumes, I think. Now, there are a couple different reasons for this. Mike Lombardi in this article was quoted saying that outside of the owners themselves, a lot of these other key decision makers in these franchises were uncomfortable with bringing in Belichick because they were trying to protect their own job. Belichick obviously has a history with having a very high level of power and influence on an ownership group. His stature and resume could be intimidating for someone willingly wanting to hire him as a subordinate, knowing the level of power that could grow with him, and didn't want to affect their standing with the franchise. But a member of one of the teams that had a head coaching vacancy this offseason spoke to ESPN in this article and raised concerns about Belichick's ability to build a culture at this point in his career. I think I disagree with that point as far as winning and unselfish play, and I know that the Patriots way is a little bit overblown, but I do think that Belichick can still provide a championship culture. But another fair point that was made as well was the fact that for an owner in a lot of these situations, and especially you look at the vacancies with a lot of these teams, they're not necessarily in the situation where they're maybe a head coach away from winning a Super Bowl and handing the keys to somebody who it would be a brand new face within your franchise, and knowing there's only there's a chance he could only coach 2 or 3 years. I understand the hesitation there. Future is very uncertain for Bill Belichick, who is one of, if not the greatest head coaches in NFL history. So as things currently stand, it seems like next year might also be difficult for him to get a job. He's going to be a year older. Now, again, like I talked about, sort of the classification of a lot of these franchises that could have a vacancy is a big deal in this. Need to sort of be more in the win now mode. Some teams that could potentially see changes in head coaches: the Bills, the Cowboys, the Steelers, the Eagles. There was a little bit of rumblings this past offseason. Tomlin's headed into his last season under his contract. Again, I think they're all sort of long shots. And speaking of long shot, there was also the rumor that was sort of thrown around there headed into the Super Bowl that if Andy Reid was going to retire, then Belichick could possibly find his way in there. Now, that's one definitely an absolute long shot. Even if Reid were to retire, I'm sure the Chiefs to some degree are looking a little bit more long-term, despite also being in win-now mode, considering their window is open as long as they have Patrick Mahomes. but it is a very interesting conversation, and I don't really know what is next for Bill Belichick, but that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Follow us on socials for more exclusive content as well. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock Eastern. We will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.